Most people believe that success is a matter of effort, that if you want it badly enough, work hard enough, optimize long enough, it will eventually come. And on the surface, that belief makes complete sense. It's logical. It's motivating. It's also, in almost every case that actually matters, wrong. Not because effort is irrelevant, it isn't, but because effort applied to the wrong level of the problem produces the same result every time: movement without arrival. Progress that resets. A ceiling that holds no matter how hard you push against it. If you have ever worked harder than most people around you and still found yourself stuck in a pattern you cannot explain, if you have ever been disciplined, committed, genuinely capable, and still watched your own breakthroughs dismantle themselves at the last possible moment, then what you're about to hear is not another framework. It is the mechanism underneath every framework you've ever tried. And once you see it, the ceiling doesn't just crack. It stops making sense entirely. Here's the provocation worth sitting with from the very beginning. The obstacle between you and the success you're capable of is not in front of you. It is not the economy, the competition, the lack of the right connections, or the wrong timing. It is inside you, specifically, in the parts of you that you buried so long ago you've forgotten they exist. Carl Jung called this territory the shadow. Not your evil, not your darkness as a moral failing. Something far more surprising than that, the repressed inventory of your own power. The ambition that was called greed, the assertiveness that was called aggression, the hunger that was called too much. These weren't your flaws. They were your instruments. And you surrendered them before you understood what they were for. What follows is the process of getting them back. Not through motivation, not through discipline. Through the only thing that has ever actually worked. The willingness to see clearly what has been running your life from the dark. There's something nobody tells you when you're building a life. You can follow every rule, stack every habit, buy every course, and still find yourself waking up at the same ceiling you've been staring at for years. It's not laziness. It's not lack of vision. It's something far more unsettling, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Most people spend their entire lives trying harder at the wrong level, pushing against a wall they can't name, wondering why nothing they do seems to stick. The problem isn't discipline. The problem is that discipline is a tool, and you've been using it to fix something it was never designed to touch. Deep down, something in you already knows this. That quiet frustration after yet another failed promise to yourself, that's not weakness. That's a signal. Here's what the books won't tell you straight. The ceiling you keep hitting isn't made of circumstance, bad luck, or the wrong strategy. It was built, quietly, carefully, long before you were old enough to understand what was happening. Decades ago, before you had words for any of this, a part of you made a decision. Not a conscious one, not the kind you'd write in a journal or announce out loud. A silent, cellular decision about who you were allowed to be, how much you were allowed to want, and how visible you were permitted to become. And that decision has been running like background software ever since, shaping every choice, every hesitation, every time you got close and somehow, mysteriously, pulled yourself back. Carl Jung called the territory beneath that decision the shadow. And he was precise about what happens when you leave it untouched. Think about the last time you were genuinely on the edge of a breakthrough. Maybe it was a business you were finally building, a relationship that was getting real, a version of yourself that was starting to feel true. And then something happened. You got distracted. You picked a fight. You got sick right before the launch. You found a reason to wait just a little longer. Most people label that moment as fear of failure. They double down on discipline. They try a new system, they read another book. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets uncomfortable. You weren't afraid of failing. You were afraid of what success would require you to become. Because the person on the other side of that breakthrough, she doesn't look like the version of you that learned to survive. And some part of you will do anything, absolutely anything, to keep that older, safer version intact. And that's the real question, isn't it? Not why don't I work hard enough, but why does the sabotage always arrive at exactly the right moment? Why does it time itself so precisely, like it knows where you're going before you do? The answer isn't random. It isn't fate. It's a pattern so old and so buried that most people never get close enough to see it clearly. But here's what you need to hold on to right now. The ceiling was built by a specific mechanism, and that mechanism can be found. It leaves fingerprints. It has a logic. And understanding that logic, really understanding it, is the first thing that has ever made it possible to move past it. The question is whether you're willing to look at where it actually came from. There's a moment in every childhood that nobody photographs. It doesn't happen at a birthday party or a first day of school. It happens quietly, in the ordinary spaces between meals and bedtime stories, in the way a room goes silent when you speak too loudly, in the way a face shifts when you want something too openly. You were watching. You were always watching. Long before you had language for it, you were running one of the most sophisticated experiments a human being ever conducts, testing, in real time, which version of yourself generated warmth and which version generated distance. You didn't choose to run this experiment. Nobody does. But every single one of us ran it. And the results shaped everything that came after, in ways most people spend their entire lives never fully understanding. Here's what made the experiment so precise. You weren't just learning what to do, you were learning what to be. The child who got loud and was told to calm down didn't just learn to lower their voice. They learned that intensity was dangerous. The child who asked for too much and was met with a sigh didn't just learn to ask less. They learned that desire was a liability. The child who shone too brightly and felt someone else dim in response didn't just pull back. They learned that visibility had a cost. These weren't lessons written on a chalkboard. They were written directly onto the nervous system, encoded in the body before the mind had any say in the matter. And the mind, being the extraordinarily efficient survival machine that it is, stored every single one of them as permanent operating instructions. What's fascinating and deeply uncomfortable is how fast the learning happened. Children don't need years to adapt. They need weeks, sometimes days. A single charged moment, repeated 3 or 4 times, is enough to reorganize an entire personality around a new rule. Psychologists call this kind of learning implicit conditioning. You might know it by its more familiar name, that's just who I am. The kid who learned that ambition made people uncomfortable became the adult who self-sabotages right before the promotion. The kid who learned that strong opinions caused conflict became the adult who agrees in the room and resents everyone in it afterward. The kid who learned that needing too much drove people away became the adult who gives endlessly and wonders why they feel so empty. The experiment ended decades ago. But the results are still running. And this is where it gets truly interesting. Because the parts of you that were rejected in that experiment, the boldness, the hunger, the intensity, the raw wanting, they didn't disappear. Nothing in the human psyche simply disappears. Energy relocates. What was pushed down went somewhere. It found a room, deep inside, away from the light, away from the judgment, away from the risk of being rejected again. And in that room, in the dark, it has been waiting. Not quietly, not patiently, but waiting nonetheless, gathering pressure, accumulating force, looking for every crack in the floor above it. You felt it. In the moments you almost said something real and stopped yourself. In the dreams that left you unsettled in the morning. In the anger that came out sideways, at the wrong person, at the wrong time. That room has a name, and what's inside it is not what you think. Imagine a house, a beautiful house, well kept, with rooms you've decorated carefully over the years. Your personality, your values, your sense of humor, the way you show up for the people you love. You know every corner of that house. You've lived in it your whole life. But there's one room you never open. Not because you forgot it was there. Because at some point, very early, you decided it was safer not to. You didn't lock it with a key. You locked it with something far stronger. With shame, with fear, with the quiet but devastating belief that what was inside was the reason you almost lost the people you needed most. So you built a wall where the door used to be. You painted over it. You put furniture in front of it. And you kept living, beautifully, in every other room. But the room didn't empty itself just because you stopped visiting. It filled up. Carl Jung spent decades trying to find the right language for what lives in that room. He called it the shadow, not because it's evil, not because it's the worst of you, but because it exists in the part of the psyche where the light of consciousness doesn't reach. And his definition was surgical in its precision. The shadow is not your darkness as a moral failure. It is the unlived portion of your own potential. Think about that for a moment. The parts of you that were called too much, too aggressive, too ambitious, too loud, too cold, too hungry, those weren't defects. They were equipment. They were instruments you were handed at birth and then pressured, shamed, or loved out of using. You didn't discard them because they were broken. You discarded them because someone flinched. And the psyche, in its loyalty to survival, made that flinch mean everything. Here's what makes the shadow so difficult to talk about in practical terms. It doesn't behave like a memory. You can't access it by thinking harder or journaling longer or meditating more sincerely. It doesn't respond to effort from the conscious mind because it didn't form there. It formed below, in sensation, in reaction, in the pre-verbal architecture of your earliest experiences. And because it formed below, it operates below. It doesn't announce itself as you. It announces itself as circumstance, as bad luck. As that's just how things go for me. As a pattern that seems to come from outside when it's actually being generated from within. Jung was blunt about this. What you refuse to make conscious will not sit politely in the basement. It will rule you from there. And it will do so with the full intelligence and energy of a part of you that has had decades to learn exactly which buttons to press. What fills that room is not what most people expect to find. When people finally get close enough to look, really look, they don't find monsters. They find refugees. They find the ambition that was called greed, the assertiveness that was called rudeness, the confidence that was called arrogance, the desire that was called dangerous, the hunger that was called too much. These aren't your enemies. They are the most alive parts of you, still wearing the uniforms the world dressed them in the day they were sent away. And here's what nobody prepares you for. Those parts are not passive. They are not waiting quietly for you to heal enough to welcome them back. They are pressing against the walls of that room with everything they have. And the pressure shows up somewhere. It always shows up somewhere. The question isn't whether your shadow is affecting your life. The question is whether you're ready to understand exactly how. Picture this. You've been working toward something for months, maybe years. A business that finally has momentum. A relationship that's becoming something real. A version of yourself that's starting to feel true in a way the old version never quite did. And then, right there at the threshold, something happens. Not a dramatic catastrophe. Something small. An argument that didn't need to happen. A decision that made no logical sense. A sudden, inexplicable urge to slow down, to wait, to reconsider, to burn it down quietly before anyone notices how close you actually got. And afterward, you tell yourself it was fear of failure. You double down on discipline. You find a better system. You promise yourself that next time you'll push through. But next time arrives, and the pattern repeats itself with surgical precision at exactly the same altitude, as if something inside you already knows the coordinates of your own ceiling and has been mapping it for years. Here's the truth that changes everything. and it's deeply uncomfortable, so stay with it. You are not afraid of failing. You have failed before. You survived it. You got back up. Failure is familiar. Failure is something the version of you that was built to survive already knows how to handle. What you are actually afraid of is succeeding in a way that makes the old version of you impossible to return to. Read that again, because that sentence explains more about your life than any book on productivity, mindset, or habit formation ever will. The identity you carry, the way you describe yourself, the role you play in your family, the story you tell about who you are and what you're capable of, was not freely chosen. It was assembled, piece by piece, as a survival strategy. And every survival strategy has one non-negotiable rule written into its foundation. Do not become someone these people can no longer recognize. Real success violates that rule. Not metaphorically. Literally, because real success requires exactly the qualities you exiled. It requires the ambition your family quietly called greed, the assertiveness your teachers labeled as rudeness, the visibility your culture taught you to call vanity, the cold clarity someone once dismissed as heartless, the hunger someone once told you was too much. To reach the next level, the real next level, not the comfortable approximation of it, you have to become the person you were punished for being. And some part of you, the part that learned very early that punishment feels like abandonment, and abandonment feels like death, will not allow it without a fight. That part doesn't panic about failure. It panics about what success will cost in love, in belonging, in the familiar sense of self you've been holding on to since you were small. So the sabotage isn't random, it isn't weakness, it isn't a character flaw you need to discipline yourself out of. It is a perfectly coordinated defense, executed by a part of you that is still trying to protect the child you used to be. The procrastination on the one task that would change everything. The fight picked right before the breakthrough. The illness that arrives the week of the launch. The hollow dread that replaces satisfaction the moment you actually reach the thing you've been chasing. These are not accidents. They are messages. They are a part of you speaking the only language it knows, disruption, because it doesn't know yet that the threat has passed, that you are no longer small, that you can survive being seen. The question worth sitting with now is this: if the saboteur isn't your enemy, but a protector operating on outdated information, what would it take to show it that the world it was built to survive no longer exists? Think about the last person who truly got under your skin. Not someone who wronged you in an obvious way. Not someone who took something from you or broke a clear boundary. Someone whose very existence seemed to produce a reaction in you that was bigger than the situation deserved. Maybe it was someone at work who moved through the room with a confidence that felt almost offensive. Maybe it was someone online whose self-promotion made your jaw tighten in a way you couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was a friend of a friend whose ambition seemed shameless, whose visibility felt like an intrusion, whose refusal to apologize for taking up space struck you as something close to immoral. You told yourself it was a reasonable observation. You told yourself you were simply seeing them clearly. But here's what Jung understood about that reaction, and what almost nobody is willing to hear. You weren't seeing them. You were seeing yourself, the version of yourself you buried so long ago you forgot it was ever yours. This is one of the most precise and merciless laws of the human psyche, and Jung stated it without softening it: what you cannot tolerate in others is almost always what you have refused to tolerate in yourself. Not sometimes, not occasionally, almost always. And the measurement isn't in the observation, it's in the intensity. Mild distaste means very little. A quiet preference for different behavior tells you something small. But the reactions that consume you, the ones that loop in your head for days, the ones that make your body respond before your mind catches up, the ones that feel strangely personal even when the other person is a stranger, those are not observations, those are projections. The psyche, in its extraordinary efficiency, takes what it cannot hold inside and places it onto the nearest available surface. And the surfaces it chooses are never random. They are always the people carrying the qualities you most need to reclaim. Here's a practice worth trying, not as a self-improvement exercise, but as a genuine act of reconnaissance. Take a piece of paper and write down, without editing yourself, the 5 qualities that most intensely irritate you in successful people. Not mild criticism, the visceral ones. She's so full of herself. He's ruthless. They're shameless. They only care about results. They think the rules don't apply to them. Write exactly what comes up, in the exact language it arrives in. Then sit with what you've written, because that list is not a description of other people. It is an inventory of the energies you have exiled in yourself. Every line is a capacity locked behind a judgment. Every judgment is the lock. The person whose confidence infuriates you is carrying your confidence. The person whose ambition seems obscene is living out your ambition. You handed them the keys without knowing it. And now, without realizing it, you resent them for driving a life you were supposed to be living. What makes this so quietly devastating is the practical consequence nobody talks about. Projection doesn't only distort how you see others, it amputates what you can do. If your assertiveness has been projected onto people you've labeled aggressive, you cannot negotiate firmly. You cannot charge what your work is worth. You cannot hold a position under pressure without collapsing or over-explaining. If your ambition lives inside the shadow, wearing the face of someone you despise, you do not have access to your ambition. Not really. Not in the clean, directed, unapologetic way that building something real requires. The qualities are still yours. They were always yours. But as long as they live outside you, in the people you criticize, in the behavior you find offensive, in the success you quietly resent, you cannot use them. And without them, the ceiling holds. Not because the world is blocking you, because you are. With extraordinary precision and zero awareness. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't announce itself as pain. It shows up as criticism. As a comment made too quickly with too much heat behind it about someone who just got the thing you've been circling for years. It shows up in the way you scroll past a success story and feel something that isn't quite admiration and isn't quite envy, but lives in the uncomfortable territory between the two. It shows up in the careful, reasonable-sounding arguments you build for why that person's achievement doesn't really count. They got lucky. They compromised something. They're not as solid as they seem. You tell yourself you're being discerning. You tell yourself you're simply maintaining standards. But underneath the commentary, underneath the critique, something far more honest is happening. You are looking at a version of yourself you decided long ago you are not allowed to become. And the looking hurts in a way that criticism disguises beautifully. Here's the mechanism, laid out plainly. Every quality you cannot allow yourself to embody has to go somewhere. The psyche doesn't tolerate a vacuum. What you refuse to own in yourself gets projected outward onto the people who are living it openly, unapologetically, in full view. And once it's out there, wearing someone else's face, you are free to criticize it. Because criticism creates distance, and distance lets you keep pretending that quality was never yours to begin with. The entrepreneur who makes you uncomfortable with her self-promotion is carrying your visibility. The executive who seems ruthlessly focused is carrying your ambition. The artist who seems almost narcissistically confident in his work is carrying your self-belief. You didn't lose those qualities. You outsourced them. You found people willing to live them out in the open so you could keep yours safely buried and still have access to the feeling of them, from a distance, through the strange intimacy of contempt. And here's what that costs you in real, practical terms. You cannot use a capacity you have spent your life disowning. This isn't a metaphor. It's a functional reality. If your assertiveness lives inside the shadow, locked behind the judgment that assertive people are aggressive, that assertive people hurt others, that assertiveness is something you were punished for once and cannot afford to revisit, then you cannot negotiate firmly when it counts. You'll soften the ask. You'll accept less than the work deserves. You'll explain yourself 3 times when once would have been enough, or stay silent when speaking would have changed everything. If your ambition is projected onto people you quietly resent, you do not have clean access to your own drive. It will leak out sideways, in restlessness, in frustration, in the low hum of a life that feels like it's always one step behind where it should be. You have the engine, you just can't reach the controls. What would it look like to take them back? Start by noticing, genuinely noticing, without rushing to justify, the next time a successful person produces a reaction in you that feels disproportionate. Don't analyze it immediately. Don't defend it. Just stay with the feeling long enough to ask one honest question. What specific quality is this person embodying that I have told myself I am not allowed to have? It might be directness. It might be the audacity to charge what they're worth. It might be the willingness to be visibly, unapologetically proud of something they built. Whatever it is, that quality is yours. It always was. The work isn't to become that person. The work is to stop pretending that what they're carrying doesn't belong to you. Because as long as your most powerful instruments are living in other people's hands, the life you're capable of will keep appearing just out of reach, close enough to see, far enough to hurt. Here's the thing about the shadow that makes it so difficult to work with directly. It doesn't want to be found. Not because it's malicious, but because the entire reason it went underground in the first place was to stay hidden. The psyche built the wall carefully, reinforced it over decades, and developed an immune system designed specifically to protect it from the light of conscious awareness. Every time you get close, something in you will look away. Change the subject. Rationalize, get defensive in a way that feels completely justified. Go suddenly, inexplicably tired. This isn't weakness. It's the same intelligence that assembled your survival strategy in the first place, now working overtime to keep it intact. Which means that sitting quietly and asking yourself what you're repressing will almost never work. The shadow doesn't answer to direct questioning. It has to be caught in motion. And fortunately, because Jung was nothing if not precise, it always moves in the same 3 directions. The first is projection, and you already know this one because you've been living inside it. But knowing it conceptually and actually catching it in real time are 2 very different things. Here's how to make it practical. For the next 7 days, every time you feel a strong negative reaction to someone else's success, confidence, or behavior, don't dismiss it and don't indulge it. Write it down. Not in polished language, in the raw, unfiltered words it arrives in. She thinks she's better than everyone. He has no shame. They'll do anything to win. Keep the list without editing it. By the end of the week, you won't be looking at a collection of observations about other people. You'll be looking at a map. Each entry is a border. Each judgment is a door. And behind each door is a version of you that was sent away before you were old enough to understand what you were losing. The second trace is disproportionate reaction. This one is subtler, and in some ways more revealing. It shows up in the moments when your emotional response is clearly, unmistakably larger than the event that triggered it. A small piece of criticism that consumes your entire week. A minor embarrassment that replays in your mind for months. A flash of shame so violent it makes your body go cold over something a stranger would have forgotten in an hour. The size of the reaction is the signal. The event was small, what was touched was not. Something in the shadow was grazed and the entire system lit up in defense. When this happens, and it will happen, because it always does, don't rush to explain it away. Instead, ask one precise question. What specifically did that moment accuse me of? Not the surface story. The underlying accusation. That accusation is the exact border of the shadow. That's where the buried material lives. The third trace is dreams. And this is the one most people dismiss too quickly, because the modern mind has been trained to see dreams as noise rather than signal. But Jung took dreams seriously for a reason that holds up under scrutiny. In sleep, the defenses fall. The conscious mind, with all its careful editing and rationalization, goes offline. And what steps into that space, the pursuer, the intruder, the dark stranger, the figure of your same sex who unsettles you in a way you can't explain, is often the shadow stepping out in personified form, not as a symbol to decode like a puzzle, as information to sit with. What does that figure do? What quality do they carry? What are they demanding? Or what are they hiding? Write it down the moment you wake, before the daylight mind sanitizes it into something comfortable. These three practices together, projection mapping, reaction tracking, dream recording, are not therapy. They are reconnaissance. And what you find when you look honestly will almost certainly surprise you. There's a kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. You know the one. You wake up after 8 hours and the tiredness is still there, not in your body exactly, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that rest doesn't seem to reach. You've blamed it on the workload, on the pace of modern life, on stress, on screens, on the 1,000 small demands that stack up before breakfast. And some of that is true, but there's another layer underneath all of it that almost nobody talks about, because it requires a level of honesty that most people aren't quite ready for. A significant portion of the energy you think you're spending on building your life is actually being spent on something else entirely. On a war. A silent, invisible, decades-long war being fought not against the world outside you, but against the parts of yourself you decided, long ago, were too dangerous to let live. Here's what repression actually costs, in practical terms. Every quality you have locked away doesn't stay locked for free. It has to be held down. Actively, continuously, without a single day off. The aggression you were shamed out of has to be pressed below the surface every time it stirs. In a meeting where someone takes credit for your work, in a negotiation where you know you should push back but don't, in a conversation where someone crosses a line and you smile and let it pass. The ambition you learn to hide has to be muted every time it rises. Every time you start to want something clearly and specifically and out loud, and something in you immediately reaches for the volume dial. The visibility you long for has to be strangled the instant it surfaces. Every time you create something worth sharing and then hesitate, soften, shrink it down to something safer before anyone can see the full force of what it actually was. This work never stops. And it is being paid for out of the same reservoir you are trying to use to build something real. Jung made this point with a clarity that most modern psychology still hasn't fully absorbed. The shadow is not only a repository of what you rejected, it is a reservoir of energy, raw, unformed, and enormous. And the irony is almost unbearable once you see it. The very force you've been fighting against your whole life is the same force you've been desperately trying to find. The drive that isn't there when you need it. The confidence that shows up and then disappears. The focus that comes in flashes but never seems to hold. You've been trying to generate those things from the outside. Through better habits, stronger discipline, the right morning routine, the right mentor, the right environment. And none of it has been enough. Not because those things don't matter, but because you've been trying to fill a tank that has a hole in it. The energy keeps draining out, straight back into the war. Think about what becomes available when the war ends. Not the energy you'd gain from sleeping better or working smarter, though those matter. The energy that comes back when you stop spending it on suppression. When the ambition you've been muting is finally allowed to speak at full volume. When the assertiveness you've been restraining is finally allowed to move through you cleanly, without the layer of guilt and second-guessing that currently wraps around every firm decision you try to make. Athletes talk about flow states, those rare moments when every part of the system is moving in the same direction, when there's no internal friction, when effort feels effortless, because nothing is working against anything else. What they're describing, without knowing it, is what becomes possible when integration begins. Not the absence of challenge, the absence of the war. And what gets built in that silence is something most people only ever catch a glimpse of, in their best moments, on their best days, before the old pattern pulls them back. There's a moment in this work that almost nobody prepares you for. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't feel like an awakening or a revelation or the kind of dramatic transformation that makes for a good story. It feels, at first, like something loosening. Like a tension you'd lived with so long you'd stop noticing it, the way you stop hearing a sound that's always there, suddenly beginning to release. It happens when one of the exiled parts of you, one of the qualities that was sent away before you could understand what it was for, finds its way back into the household. Not because you forced it, not because you performed some ritual of acceptance, but because you finally looked at it long enough, honestly enough, without flinching, and it understood for the first time in decades that it was safe to come home. What happens next is not what most people expect, and it changes everything. Let's start with the one that surprises people most: the aggression, the intensity, the part of you that was called too much, too loud, too forceful. The part that learned to go underground because the full force of it once produced a flinch in someone whose love you couldn't afford to lose. When that part integrates, it does not return as cruelty. It does not return as the thing you were afraid it would become if you ever stopped holding it down. It returns as the capacity to hold a position under pressure without collapsing, to say no without writing a 3-paragraph apology for it, to negotiate firmly, clearly, without the layer of guilt that currently wraps around every boundary you try to set, to defend what you've built without dismantling yourself the moment someone pushes back. If you've ever undercharged for work that cost you years, over-explained a decision that needed no explanation, or stayed in a situation long past the point your body was telling you to leave, that's what the absence of integrated aggression looks like in real life. And that's what changes when it comes home. The ambition follows a different path back. The hunger that was called greed, the wanting that was told it was too much, the drive that learned to disguise itself as something more socially acceptable, when that integrates, it doesn't return as exploitation. It returns as direction, the willingness to want something specific, out loud, without immediately softening it into something smaller and safer. The ability to pursue it without the self-sabotage that currently arrives at every threshold as a kind of preemptive penance, as if wanting too much requires punishment before the punishment can find you. And then there's the visibility, the confidence that was called arrogance, the self-belief that was labeled narcissism, the part of you that wanted to be seen and was taught that wanting to be seen was dangerous. When that returns, it doesn't become vanity. It becomes the simple adult capacity to put your work in front of people without apologizing for its existence. To speak with authority when you have it. To stop hiding as a form of politeness that serves nobody, least of all the people your work was built to reach. Here's what Jung was precise about and what's worth holding on to as this unfolds. Integration is not permission. It is not a license to become hard, or ruthless, or cold. It is not the unleashing of everything you suppressed, as if removing the dam means flooding everything downstream. What integration actually looks like is this. The quality returns, but it returns into relationship with the rest of you. The aggression is held by your values. The ambition is shaped by your conscience. The visibility is grounded in something real. The qualities that were dangerous when they were raw and unformed and carried by a child who had no context for them, those same qualities, returned to an adult who has done this work, become instruments. Precise, powerful, finally usable. You are not becoming someone new. You are unfreezing someone old. Someone who was always there, always capable, always carrying more than the small safe version of you was ever allowed to show. And the life that becomes possible from that place is not the life you've been building. It's the one you've been circling. There's a particular emptiness that only successful people know. Not the emptiness of failure. That one is loud, it has a clear cause, it points somewhere. This one is quieter and, in many ways, harder to sit with. It arrives after the achievement. After the launch, the promotion, the relationship that finally looked the way you always said you wanted it to look. You get there, you actually get there, to the place you spent years working toward, and instead of the fullness you were promised, there's a strange, hollow feeling. A flatness where the satisfaction was supposed to be. A quiet panic that the person who arrived is not quite the person who wanted it. And because nobody talks about this honestly, most people interpret that emptiness as a sign they need more. A bigger goal, a different industry, a new relationship, another level. So they start chasing again. And the pattern continues, not because they're doing something wrong, because they're doing everything right with half of themselves missing. Jung spent his life returning to this point from every possible direction, and the conclusion was always the same. Wholeness is not something you build through acquisition. It is something you recover through honesty. And the person who refuses that recovery, who keeps optimizing the acceptable half, who keeps achieving from a divided psyche, will spend their entire life in what he called a strange, functional suffering. Accomplished on the outside, internally starving, admired by people who are looking at a performance they've mistaken for a person. Because that's what success built from the exiled self actually produces. A result that looks right from the outside and feels hollow from the inside. Because the part of you that was most alive, most real, most fully yours, was never allowed into the room where the work was being done. And no external achievement has ever been able to compensate for that absence. Not one. Not ever. Here's what changes when the integration is real. Not the achievements, those may look similar from the outside. What changes is the texture of them. The solidity, the way they land in the body. Success built from a whole self doesn't produce that hollow feeling at the finish line, because the person who arrives is the same person who set out, not a carefully curated version of them, not the half that learned to perform, but the full, integrated, sometimes uncomfortable, deeply alive totality of who they actually are. The ceiling that held for years doesn't hold anymore, not because the world changed, but because the self became larger than the altitude the unconscious was trained to defend. And that shift, that quiet, irreversible expansion of what you can hold, what you can build, what you can sustain, is the only growth that doesn't eventually collapse back into the old pattern. It is the only foundation that doesn't crack under the weight of real ambition. And so the question that remains, the one worth sitting with long after this ends, is not whether you have what it takes. You always had what it took. The question is how much of it you've been leaving in the room with no door. How much of your drive has been locked behind the judgment that wanting too much is dangerous. How much of your assertiveness has been buried under the belief that taking up space will cost you love. How much of your visibility has been hidden behind a politeness that was never really about other people. It was about keeping yourself small enough to feel safe. The work of integration is not the work of becoming someone new. It is the work of finally, fully, unapologetically becoming someone old. Someone you were before the experiment taught you which parts of yourself were worth keeping. That person never left. They just went underground. And everything you've been trying to build on the surface, the success, the freedom, the life that actually feels like yours, has been waiting for them to come back. So here you are, at the end of something that was never really about information. You didn't just learn a concept today. You came face to face with a pattern that has been shaping your life since before you had words for it, quietly, precisely, with a loyalty to the old version of you that was never asked for and never needed. And now you have a choice that most people never actually get to make consciously. Not the choice between working harder or working smarter, Not the choice between this strategy or that one. The real choice, the one underneath all the others. Between continuing to build from the divided self that got you here, or finally, fully bringing the whole of who you are into the work. Between the ceiling that has held for years and the version of you that is larger than it. Between the life that looks right from the outside and the one that actually feels like yours from the inside. Here's what this work actually asks of you, and it's simpler than you might expect, though not easier. Start with one projection. Just one. Think of the person whose success, confidence, or ambition produces a reaction in you that is bigger than the situation deserves. Don't analyze them. Analyze the reaction. Ask yourself, honestly, without rushing to a comfortable answer, what specific quality are they carrying that I have told myself I am not allowed to have? Write it down. Not in your head, where the editing happens automatically. On paper, where the truth has nowhere to hide. That single act, that one honest question asked and answered without flinching, is not a small thing. It is the first real crack in a wall that has been holding for decades. And cracks, once they start, have a logic of their own. Because here's what nobody tells you about this work once it begins. It doesn't stay contained. You pull one thread, one honest acknowledgement of one exiled quality, and something in the whole structure begins to shift. The negotiations you've been losing start going differently. The work you've been hiding starts finding its way into the light. The relationships that were built on the old version of you start revealing what they actually are. And the ones built on something real get stronger. The sabotage that arrived like clockwork at every threshold begins to lose its timing because the part of you it was protecting no longer needs the same protection. You don't become someone new, you become someone whole. And wholeness, as it turns out, is not a feeling. It is a foundation. The only one that doesn't crack under the weight of a life that is actually, finally, fully yours. So let me ask you something directly, and I want you to sit with it rather than answer it too quickly. What is the one quality you have spent the longest time pretending you don't have? Not the one you're least proud of, the one you are most afraid to claim. The ambition that feels too naked. The assertiveness that feels too hard. The hunger that feels too much. The confidence that feels too close to arrogance for comfort. What would your life look like? Your work, your relationships, your sense of what's possible, if that quality came home? If you stopped outsourcing it to the people you quietly resent and let it live in you, where it always belonged. That question is not rhetorical. It is the beginning of the only conversation that actually changes anything. Leave your answer in the comments below because the moment you name it, something shifts. The exile hears its own name spoken out loud for the first time in years. And that, more than any strategy or system or framework, is how the ceiling begins to move. If this reached something in you, if something here woke up that you've been keeping quiet for a long time, don't let that feeling pass without doing something with it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notifications, because what we go into here goes deeper every time. This isn't content designed to make you feel good for an hour. It's designed to make you see more clearly for the rest of your life. And there is so much more to see.